It was on May 5th in the year 1821 that Napoleon Bonaparte, the former French ruler who once ruled an empire that stretched across Europe, continues his eternity as a British prisoner on the remote island of St. Helena in the southern Atlantic Ocean. The Corsica-born Napoleon, one of the greatest military strategists in history, rapidly rose into the ranks of the French Revolutionary Army during the late 1790s. By 1799, France was at war with most of Europe, and Napoleon returned home from his Egyptian campaign to take over the reins of the French government and save his nation from collapse. After becoming first consul in February of 1800, he recognized his army and defeated Austria. In 1802, he established the Napoleonic Code, a new system of French law, and in 1804 was crowned Emperor of France in Notre Dame Cathedral. By 1807, Napoleon controlled an empire that stretched from the river Elbe in the north, down through Italy in the south, and from the Pyrenees to the Dalmatian coast. Beginning in 1812, Napoleon began to encounter the first significant defeats of his military career, suffering through a disastrous invasion of Russia, losing Spain to the Duke of Wellington in the Peninsular War, and enduring total defeat against the Allied force by 1814. Exiled to the island of Elba, he escaped to France in early 1815 and raised a new grand army that enjoyed temporary success before its crushing defeat at Waterloo against an Allied force under Wellington on June 18th in 1815. Napoleon was subsequently exiled to the island of St. Helena off the coast of Africa. 6 years later, he continued his eternity, most likely of stomach cancer, and in 1840, his body was returned to Paris, where it was interred in the Hotel des Invalides, or Hotel des Invalides. Look it up. It was May 5th in 1961 that Navy Commander Alan Bartlett Shepard Jr. is launched into space aboard the Freedom 7 space capsule, becoming the first American astronaut to travel into space. The suborbital flight, which lasted 15 minutes and reached a height of 116 miles into the atmosphere, was a major triumph for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. NASA was established in 1958 to keep U.S. space efforts abreast of recent Soviet achievements, such as the launching of the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the two superpowers raced to become the first country to put a man in space and return him to Earth. On April 12th, in 1961, the Soviet space Kremlin won that race with cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. He was launched into space and put in orbit around the planet and safely returned to Earth. 1 month later, Shepard's suborbital flight restored faith in the U.S. space program. NASA continued to trail the Soviets closely until the late 1960s and the successes of the Apollo lunar program. In July of 1969, we took a giant leap forward with Apollo 11, a three-stage spacecraft that took our nation's astronaut to the surface of the moon and returned him to Earth. On February 5th in 1971, Alan Shepard, the first American in space, became the fifth astronaut to walk on the moon as part of the Apollo 14 lunar landing mission. Awesome. was May 5th in the year 1981 that imprisoned Irish Catholic militant Bobby Sands continues his eternity after refusing food for 66 days in protest of his treatment as a criminal rather than as a political prisoner by British authorities. Wow. His continuance of eternity immediately touched off widespread rioting in Belfast, as young Irish Catholic militants clashed with police and British Army patrols. Bobby Sands was born into a Catholic family in a Protestant area of Belfast, Northern Ireland in 1954. In 1972, sectarian violence forced his family to move to public housing in a Catholic area, where Sands was recruited by the Provisional Irish Republican Army, or IRA. The Provisional IRA formed in 1969 after a break with the official IRA advocated violence and terrorism as a means of winning independence for Northern Ireland from Britain. The Provisional IRA, the dominant branch, is generally referred to as simply the IRA. After independence, according to the IRA, Northern Ireland would be united with the Republic of Ireland in a socialist Irish republic. In 1972, Sands was arrested and convicted of taking part in several IRA robberies. Because he was convicted for IRA activities, he was given special category status and sent to a prison that was more akin to a prisoner of war camp because it allowed freedom of dress and freedom of movement within the prison grounds. He spent 4 years there. After less than a year back on the streets, Sands was arrested in 1977 for gun possession near the scene of an IRA bombing and sentenced to 14 years in prison. Because the British government had enacted a policy of criminalization of Irish terrorists in 1976, Sands was imprisoned as a dangerous criminal in the Maze prison south of Belfast. During the next few years from his cell in the Maze, he joined other imprisoned IRA terrorists in protest demanding restoration of the freedoms they had previously enjoyed under special category status. In 1980, a hunger strike lasted 53 days before it was called off when one of the protesters fell into a coma. In response, the British government offered a few concessions to the prisoners, but they failed to deliver all they had promised and protests resumed. Sands did not take a direct part in the 1980 strike, but he acted as the IRA appointed leader and the spokesperson of the protesting prisoners. On March 1st in 1981, the 5th anniversary of the British policy of criminalization, Bobby Sands launched a new hunger strike. He took only water and salt, and his weight dropped from 155 to 95 pounds. After 2 weeks, another protester joined the strike, and 6 days after that, 2 more. On April 9th, in the midst of the strike, Sands was elected to a vacant seat in the British Parliament from Fermanagh in South Tyrone in Northern Ireland. Parliament subsequently introduced legislation to disqualify convicts serving prison sentences for eligibility in Parliament. His election and fears of violence after his continuance of eternity drew international attention to Sands' protests. In the final week of his life on this planet, Pope John Paul II sent a personal envoy to urge Sands to give up the strike. He refused. On May 3rd, he fell into a coma, and in the early morning of May 5th, he continued his eternity. Fighting raged for days in Belfast, and tens of thousands attended his funeral on May 7th. After Bobby Sands pushed off into the eternity, the hunger strike continued, and 9 more men continued their eternity before it was called off on October 3rd in 1981, under pressure from Catholic Church leaders and the prisoners' families. In the aftermath of the strike, the administration of the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher agreed to give in to several of the protesters' demands, including the right to wear civilian clothing and the right to receive mail-in visits. Prisoners were also allowed to move more freely and no longer were subject to harsh penalties for refusing prison work. Official recognition of their political status, however, was not granted.